My name is Sven Thorvaldsen. Today we're going to glance at 1,000 years of church history in 20 minutes. It's really an impossible task, frankly. Christianity in 500 is not Christianity in 1500. Much changes, even if certain things remain the same. If Matthew had time, he would want to tell you all about Anselm and Aquinas and Bonaventure, and, of course, Thorlak Thorhalson and St. Olav, as well as Gregory Palamas and Athanasius of the great Lavra on Mount Athos. And if he knew anything about him, Athanasius the Demon Crusher. But he can't, so you get this video instead.
Thank you, Sven. In the year 500, the Church in Western Europe covered essentially only those places that were part of the former Roman Empire, plus North Africa and Ireland. In 1387, the forced Christianization of Lithuania, the last pagan nation in Europe, began. In between England, Scotland, and those parts of Wales that did not yet have Christians, most of Germany and Austria, Scandinavia, Hungary, Poland, the Czech and Slovak peoples, the Finns and the Latvians and Estonians, as well as a variety of smaller peoples of Central Europe, accepted Christianity and formed the medieval entity we think of as Latin Christendom, often at the same time as joining a nearby empire or kingdom. In 1492, the union of state and church that, for good and for ill, made Christendom a reality, saw the realization of the Reconquista of Spain and the expulsion of the final Muslims out of the Iberian Peninsula. The church in western North Africa was already long gone. When we think about the Middle Ages, this is the story most of us reckon. There are 2 or 3 parallel stories, however. In the year 500, the church in Eastern Europe covered essentially only the Roman Empire, called by most of us today the Byzantine Empire, at this stage in its history. Over the next millennium, the Slavonic peoples, some of whom would invade Roman territory, would embrace the orthodoxy of the Byzantine Church. Because of the sheer size of Russia, as well as the fluidity of the northern Eurasian border between Asia and Europe, I do not know when the last Eastern Europeans, pagans, became Orthodox. In the middle of the continent, they had contacts with the Latin Church, not always friendly, ranging from missionary competition to inter-Christian warfare based partly on religion, partly on nationhood. In the year 500, the church in the Middle East covered not only the Roman Empire, modern Turkey, Syria, Palestine, Jordan, bits of Iraq, Sinai, Egypt, but also the non-Roman polities in Armenia and Georgia, besides the African Christians in Nubia, modern Sudan, and Aksum, Ethiopia. There were Christians in the Persian Empire, not just in Mesopotamia at Nineveh, which is modern Mosul in Iraq, but in the then Persian capital at Seleucia, Ctesiphon, and eastwards, with a missionary impulse that would push through Central Asia to India and China beyond in the coming centuries. While Christianity in Egypt, Syria, Palestine, Iraq, Iran, and India never died out, it was killed twice in China by different regimes in the Middle Ages, and suffered great setbacks in the Middle East and Central Asia. The idea that there were medieval Christian churches in Baghdad, Samarkand, and as far east as Beijing is foreign to us. Nonetheless, 1/3 of the world's medieval Christians lived in Asia and Africa, forgotten though they may be to their European siblings today. I am still learning about these churches, so they will inevitably get short shrift today. Thus, not only are the Middle Ages fully 1/2 of Christian history, they are also a big, broad, diverse period of the history of Christianity. Not even the medieval Latin West, with its reputation for forced conversions, crusades, inquisitions, top-down power structures, is a straightforward story devoid of diversity. Sticking to the theme of spiritual disciplines and the expansion of Christianity, let me discuss 3 topics in the rest of this video. 1. Monk missionaries. 2. Christianity and Islam. 3. Care for the poor. Let's go. The question has been posed to me since the last video. How does monasticism jive with evangelism? Given the number of monks who were evangelists, including St. Benedict himself, it seems that it did. I have 2 thoughts about this besides the actual historic facts. 1. Pre-modern Christianity is less individualistic than Christianity today. This means that they would have seen the Great Commission of Matthew 28 as a function of the whole church, rather than a command to every individual Christian. The church as a whole was to go out and to make disciples of every nation. Therefore, they saw their lives of prayer and discipline as an internal witness to holiness for the rest of the church, to join, be strengthened by, or emulate. 2. One response from some modern monks, as discussed in Kyriakos Markides' book, The Mountain of Silence, which is about Cypriot monasticism, is that their prayers are essential for upholding the mission of the church. Evangelism and the making of disciples is empowered by the praying of the monks. It should be noted, though, that those very same monks in the Mountain of Silence run a rehab center in the Troodos Mountains, so they're not exactly stereotypes. Few monastics in history have been the stereotype. So, let's pick up where we left off on last week's video. England was no longer Roman at all. It was a pagan country made up of many small kingdoms, speaking a Germanic barbarian language with no literature of its own. In 597, missionaries from Pope Gregory the Great in Rome arrived in Canterbury, led by the former abbot of Gregory's monastery, Augustine, not to be confused with the guy from Africa, who was more than a century before this, who died more than a century before this. And he had 40 companions whom we assume were monks. According to the Venerable Bede's Ecclesiastical History of the English People, written 130-ish years later, as soon as they had entered the dwelling place allotted to them, they began to imitate the way of life of the apostles and of the primitive church. They were constantly engaged in prayers, in vigils and fasts. They preached the word of life to as many as they could. They despised all worldly things as foreign to them. They accepted only the necessaries of life from those whom they taught. In all things they practiced what they preached and kept themselves prepared to endure adversities, even to the point of dying for the truths they proclaimed. To put it briefly, some, marveling at their simple and innocent way of life and the sweetness of their heavenly doctrine, believed and were baptized. There was nearby on the east of the city a church built in ancient times in honor of St. Martin, while the Romans were still in Britain, in which the queen, who was a Christian, used to pray. In this church they first began to meet, to chant the psalms, to pray, to say mass, to preach, and to baptize, until, when the king had been converted to the faith, they received greater liberty to preach everywhere and to build or restore churches. At last, which historians think was a few years later, the king, as well as others, believed and was baptized, being attracted by the pure life of the saints and by their most precious promises, whose truth they confirmed by performing many miracles. Every day, more and more began to flock to hear the word, to forsake their heathen worship, and through faith, to join the unity of Christ's holy church. It is related that the king, although he rejoiced at their conversion and their faith, compelled no one to accept Christianity, though nonetheless he showed greater affection for believers, since they were his fellow citizens in the kingdom of heaven. But he had learned from his teachers and guides in the way of salvation that the service of Christ was voluntary and ought not to be compulsory. So that is the account of the conversion of the first English king, who was a Christian. That's the translation from Judith McClure and Roger Collins for Oxford World. What we see here is the Acts 4 model, which I mentioned in video 1, being used as a template for a monastic community. They pray, they do all of these things that are both monkish and apostolic. And these monks are making disciples in purity of life. The simplicity and holiness of their life is key to the making of these disciples in England. Augustine was not the first monk missionary on the Isle of Britain. The year he arrived in Canterbury, 597, marks the death of St. Columba on Iona. Columba was a missionary from Ireland to the kingdom of the Picts. In the traditional Irish model, he used the monastery that he founded on Iona as a base for mission. Monk missionaries would come from Iona to Northumberland, the northern English kingdom. They settled at Lindisfarne in the 630s. One famous bishop abbot of Lindisfarne was Cuthbert, about whom Bede also wrote, and he preached Christianity not only to the nobility but to the common people of the north of England and south of Scotland, which were part of the same kingdom at the time. Anglo-Saxon and Irish monk missionaries would take Christianity back to the European continent, such as Columbanus in the late 500s and St Kilian, an Irish monk of Iona almost a century later. Some, like Columbanus, were internal missionaries, or to use modern terms, revival preachers, if you will. Some, like Willibrord, were missionaries amongst pagans, and some, like Boniface, did a bit of both. Wherever they went, they brought with them a commitment to the monastic path of Christianity. In the High Middle Ages, monasticism in Latin Christendom acquired a strange bedfellow, the knight. The famous, or infamous, Templars and Hospitallers founded in the mid-1100s are the earliest military orders of monks who were also knights. For the expansion of Christianity into Central Europe, and especially the Baltic, it was the Teutonic Knights, founded in 1190, who were key. Whereas the earlier monk missionaries sought to bring Christianity in an apostolic mode like Acts 4, the Teutonic Knights were not afraid to use their swords to bring the Christian faith to Europe's last pagans. Two long-term results of this. 1. When the Teutonic Knights turned their attention to Russia, their defeat by Alexander Nevsky served only to deepen the Russian commitment to orthodoxy and hostility to Latin Catholicism, further estranging East and West. And it strikes me as significant that the Russian Orthodox Cathedral in Paris is named for St. Alexander Nevsky. 2. Today, as the Baltic countries breathe political freedom, some of them for the first time in centuries, many people say the first to conquer and colonize us were the Catholics, and they go and try to rediscover pre-Christian pagan belief. The pre-modern Christian world was dotted with monasteries. Whether or not missionaries were always monks, monks would follow them almost everywhere. This is true not only of Latin Christendom, but of the Eastern churches as well. For example, the missionary activity of the Church of the East in China began around the same time as a famous Syriac inscription from the year 781, found at the site of a Christian monastery in that country. Baghdad had Christian monasteries, and as did Gundashapur in modern Iran, where the Persians had a great university, later maintained by the caliphs and populated by many Christian scholars. Which brings us to Christianity and Islam. There's a popular video here on YouTube from Business Insider that claims to cover the expansion of Christianity. However, it confuses the rise of Islam in the Eastern Mediterranean with the death of Christianity in the region, something that never happened. In the 640s, the Arab armies had extraordinary success in taking over much of the Roman Empire. They took Palestine, Judea, Syria, and Egypt. Then they swept across North Africa, while simultaneously conquering the Persian Empire. In the year 711, they conquered the Visigothic kingdom of Spain. For the rest of the Middle Ages, Christians and Muslims coexisted in Muslim territory. Consider Spain. We imagine that Spain was lost to Christians in the year 711. But what does the religion of secular ruler have to do with whether there are Christians there or not? Spanish Christians did not all flee, die, or convert in the year 711. They coexisted with their Muslim neighbors. Toledo became famous in the Middle Ages as a place where Jews, Christians, and Muslims could gather and discuss matters of religion and philosophy. The Spanish church still existed when the Reconquista got underway in full swing. They were called Mozarabs by the invading Christians from the north. These Mozarabs discovered that they had more religious freedom under the Caliphate than they did under their fellow Christians. They were forced to conform to the liturgical norms and canon law of the rest of Latin Christendom, and some of their liturgical texts are themselves more ancient than some of the Roman customs that replaced them. Today, the Spanish member of the Anglican Communion, the Reformed Episcopal Church of Spain, uses the Mozarabic liturgy translated from Latin into Spanish. In Iran, at Gundashapur, the late antique Persian emperors had established an academy. This academy continued to flourish under Islamic rule, and many Christian intellectuals of the Syriac tradition made their way there, especially in the 800s, when Al-Mamun built his famous House of Wisdom, drawing intellectuals from all traditions. Christian intellectuals were active at Baghdad from its founding, and their translations into Syriac of Aristotle and his commentators were the foundation for the later famous Arabic translations that were so important for some of the early revitalization of Aristotle in the West, until translations were made out of the Greek directly in the High Middle Ages. The famous Greek theologian John of Damascus lived his whole life under Muslim rule and was a civil servant in the city of Damascus. Moreover, Christian monasteries were built throughout the Middle East in the early centuries of Islamic rule. In Egypt, the Coptic Orthodox Church, which had already parted ways with the Catholic Orthodox Church of the Roman Empire, continued and continues to flourish. Today, it is the largest indigenous church in the Middle East. All of these Christian communities had periods of peaceful coexistence with their Muslim neighbors and rulers, and they all had periods of persecution. To spend time on Islamic persecution of Christians is not to say that religious violence is endemic or peculiar to Islam. The history of state religions shows that all major world religions are capable of persecution. So is atheism. Christians in Europe have been very good at persecuting not only Jews, pagans, and Muslims, but each other as well. In Asia, Christians found that Muslims, Buddhists, Taoists, and Hindus were just as good at persecution themselves. In the late Middle Ages, in the 1300s and 1400s, a series of persecutions by different states throughout the Asian continent brought the Church of the East to near annihilation in some places. No Christians remained in China. Their numbers in Iran and throughout Central Asia dwindled as well, with notable populations remaining largely only in Syria, Iraq, and parts of India. Whither the Christians of Samarkand and Beijing? Dead or exiled, their monasteries, cathedrals, and libraries destroyed or repurposed. Indeed, some of the Christian monasteries of China became Buddhist monasteries in the later 1300s. And today, Central Asian people who convert to Christianity are in fact thrilled to learn of these ancient and medieval Christians. I have heard that Kyrgyz people, for example, find this reassuring, that they're not Europeanizing when they embraced Christ, but returning to an older way of being Kyrgyz. Now let's talk about the spiritual discipline of acts of mercy. From the ancient to the modern church, care for the poor, the sick, the widow, the orphan, has always been part of Christianity's DNA. Almsgiving and acts of mercy may not be in the list of 12 disciplines in Richard Foster's book, Celebration of Discipline, but the ancient and medieval Christians would have considered them essential to spiritual formation. One of the main functions of the medieval Franciscans, alongside, of course, preaching repentance, which they did both locally as well as in North Africa and then as some of the first European missionaries to East Asia, was care for the poor. Not only did St. Francis promote voluntary poverty as being good for your soul, he also believed in relieving the poverty of those who suffered involuntary poverty. Thus, one of the famous stories is when the little brothers bought Francis a cloak, one particularly cold winter because they were concerned for him and his health. The first chance he got, he gave it to a beggar who had less than he did. These stories accompany Franciscans as well as urban abbeys wherever they go. Bishops, priests, and deacons could also be notable in care for the poor, such as St. John's the Almsgiver, Patriarch of Alexandria in Egypt in the 600s, who kept on selling off his property to be able to help out poor people he kept on meeting. So what about the laity of the Middle Ages then? Generally, the people we know most about are monarchs, and then other nobility, with our knowledge of individuals decreasing the lower down the social scale we go. And medieval kings and queens are not always the hardiest carers for the poor, I must admit. Neither were the merchants, mind you. They were among the earliest primary targets for Franciscan preaching in the 1200s. Nonetheless, various monarchs and nobles were devoted to caring for the poor. One example was Queen St. Margaret of Scotland, who died in 1093. Now, St. Margaret, in fact, was of the old pre-Norman line of the English kings. She was descended from King Alfred the Great, and her husband was King Malcolm III, Malcolm Canmore, son of Duncan I, which is to say, Malcolm of Shakespeare's Macbeth. Anyway, she is famous for operating what we would today call a soup kitchen, but she didn't just fund it and make sure it ran, she even volunteered at it, which is relatively rare for a noble person in this era. She also established a ferry near Edinburgh for travellers, particularly pilgrims, crossing their way to go to St Andrews. This would be modern North and South Queen's Ferry. Before the ferry, the only way to cross between northern and southern Scotland was to go many miles out of your way to Stirling Bridge and then cross there, which explains the importance of Stirling in the Wars of Independence of William Wallace and Robert the Bruce. Anyway, St. Margaret was also involved in church reform and the establishment of monasteries in the Kingdom of Scotland. In theory, part of the role of a Christian king's various administrators, as well as of the landholding knights and aristocrats, was to pay attention to the well-being of the populace, and then to correct abuses and reframe laws, and if necessary, if you're lower down in the hierarchy, to pass along concerns to whoever was next up the pecking order, all the way to the king, and if the kingdom had one, as England, France, and Scotland at least did, his parliament. This, of course, is the theory. It did not always work out. Today, we promote the idea that helping the poor and those who suffer oppression should be done out of pure altruism, to pursue social justice because it is meet and right so to do. And while it may be meet and right, it is also our bounden duty. And the medieval Christians would have said that, while compassion and a hunger for justice were all well and good, the two main reasons for care for the poor were that Christ commanded it, and because it was good for your own soul. If the point of the spiritual disciplines is to get to know God better, and if Christ says he's to be found in the poor, in Matthew 25, then, if you want to know God, you need to regard the poor here on earth. It is spiritually rewarding. This desire for heaven was as much a motivator to improve life here on earth in the Middle Ages as anything. So a few concluding thoughts. I would like to say, if you want to consider the relevance of medieval Christianity and its mindset and teaching for today's Protestant, we'll see if the light works for this. I recommend this book, Medieval Wisdom for Modern Christians, by Chris R. Armstrong, who sort of uses C.S. Lewis as a springboard for a lot of his thoughts. Not a bad idea. Lewis was a medievalist. I'll also mention some older material in the description available online underneath this video. As the Middle Ages drew to a close in the 1400s, a number of events changed the shape of world Christianity forever. Now, the church had already been obliterated in China in the early years of the Ming Dynasty, beginning in 1368, although it had suffered setbacks for a while before that, due to localized, sort of mob-based persecution. In the 1440s, attempts at reunion between the Byzantine and Latin churches failed. It seems from our perspective, for good. In 1453, Constantinople was taken by the Ottoman Turks, who had already taken the rest of the Roman Empire's European possessions, not to mention Asia Minor, which Seljuk and Ottoman Turks started invading in the 900s. And that they would continue northwest expansion over the next 2 centuries. The 1440s also saw the rise of a new technology that could accelerate the spread of new ideas, the printing press, which would be used to devastating effect in the next century by Martin Luther in his pamphlet wars. In Latin Christendom, attempts to reform an increasingly corrupt and worldly papacy, as well as many corrupt clergy, met with failure on many fronts for many reasons. A lot of clergy, including popes, bishops, and abbots, were not living lives of spiritual discipline, but lives of luxury in the late 1400s. Various aspects of church life needed to be revisited, reinvigorated, and reformed. One needn't be a Protestant to admit as much. Unfortunately, things were unraveling in many ways and in many places at once. And starting at 1517, the medieval tapestry of Latin Christianity would start to fall apart, never to be woven back together. But new horizons had appeared for European Christianity. In 1492, Columbus sailed the ocean blue. Say what we will about the results of this discovery of European conquest and settlement in the Americas, this was a whole new world for mission work and the expansion of Christianity. Thank you very much.